With that, I'll give you Ben Reddington, the head of our group, who also worked to bring about, and I'd like to thank him and Carrie at this moment for their efforts on bringing about this Fortnight for Freedom here at St. Joseph's, and certainly to all the members of our community in Frederick County. So thank you, Ben. And thank you.
Okay, now the Father says, please have my whole spiel. So welcome everyone to St. Joseph-on-Carrollton Manor's celebration of the 2014 Fortnight for Freedom. My name is Ben Reddington, one of several co-organizers of our events this year. I'll be available during and after our presentation if you have any questions or suggestions. We're recording this so we can share it with those who wouldn't be here tonight but couldn't. Begun in 2012 by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Fortnight for Freedom sets aside the 2 weeks leading up to the 4th of July as a period of reflection and emphasis on the importance of religious liberty in our lives. There's no question whether morality is the foundation of society, and we draw that morality from religion. George Washington himself said, "Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Yet it is secularism that is on the rise in the United States, highlighted by Pope Benedict after his visit here in 2012. He spoke of a radical secularism which finds increasing expression in the political and cultural spheres, which is reducing freedom of religion to mere freedom of worship. This secularism wrongly assumes that truths that have their foundation in religion, such as the sacredness of life and the family, are not truths at all. They are treated merely as political constructs, defined by government, and of such little substance that they can be changed at any time by the grudging agreement of the most recent Congress. The Fortnight for Freedom is about protecting that root of our morality, religion, and our free conduct according to it, from the interference of those who only through their title and office wield the power to diminish or distort it. So how do we know when this happens? Is it always so obvious? Without knowing the nature of and God's purpose for freedom, we simply cannot know when obstacles are placed between us and one of God's greatest gifts. Tonight we have Father Donohoo, a professor at Mount St. Mary's University, to help us understand what freedom means, especially for Catholics. After his presentation, we will go directly to any questions you might have. So, Father Donohoo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is this microphone set up correctly?
You can raise it a little bit.
Raise it just a little bit. Is that better? Okay, good. A few remarks before we get started, just to help you with my talk, which is designed to be 51 minutes and 37 seconds. Give or take. It's divided into 3 parts. The first part is the part where we need to have our thinking caps on, and to make it easier, I've given you the title of each one of my paragraphs. That's part 1, and that's roughly 75% of our work. Then we'll read together, it's on your text there, a series of statements from the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty. And then I'd like just to conclude in maybe 3 or 4 or 5 minutes with some scattered thoughts. Now, I have to say that Ben raised a number of issues in his opening remarks. I would love to talk on those, but I will not be getting to them, because I can't do everything. So I'd like to do something well rather than many things poorly. And for that reason, I think it would be helpful for us, since these issues are not going to go away, we'll always have another year and other speakers, is for me to concentrate on what perhaps I'm most responsible for, and that is to help you to understand freedom both philosophically and theologically. Now, another introductory remark is that despite the teachings of the Church on freedom, I don't see anything in this issue which is specifically Catholic as opposed to Christian, and much of it is simply human. And so in my talk, what I'll try to do is help us to understand what is exclusively Christian doctrine, which anyone in the general Orthodox Christian tradition will accept, and what is available to a well-meaning, reasonably good human being from a natural point of view who has not been somehow polluted by strange thinking. So those distinctions will help us as we proceed. Now, you will note that in this talk, we're making many, many, many distinctions, and we have to do it because freedom is a somewhat abstract concept. It's not my fault, it's my assignment, okay? If I was speaking on something like, birds or chairs or something, it'd be very concrete, but this is not, this is abstract. So there's no way around it, and in order to really be able to be intelligent speakers on this issue, even and to share with neighbors, parishioners, or with people who disagree with us, to have all these distinctions will help us in our understanding and also in communicating that to other people. Now I'm going to wear my glasses here so I can see a little bit better what I'm doing. Okay, oh, it's the wrong talk. This is a talk on the Trinity. I'm sorry. No, it's a joke. Okay. So, let's start then with a philosophical and theological introduction to freedom. This is that first part. Okay? So the first thing here is creaturely knowledge begins and ends in mystery. No being, no creature, no thing out there can be entirely grasped, understood, unless its origin is entirely understood. Because to know a being through and through requires thorough knowledge of its origin. Where did it come from? What is it for? From the perspective of our faith, our origin, both ultimately in the case of our body, which we trace back eventually to the Big Bang and to God, and immediately in the case of each of our souls, created personally by God, both these origins are found in the free creative act of the Trinity. And so in the end, the human person is an unfathomable mystery unto himself or herself. Like other mysteries of our faith and the mysteries that comprise our world, which science cannot thoroughly explain, but can explore and come to certain conclusions. Like these other mysteries, the mystery of the human being is partly knowable and partly unknowable. The more we truly deepen our knowledge of the human person, the more the mystery becomes available to us and appreciated exactly as a mystery. Now, what is said so far about us may be said about any creature. St. Thomas once said that about a housefly, all the efforts of the human mind cannot exhaust its nature. To speak precisely, he teaches we can know what a housefly is, we can know the elements that comprise it, but we cannot know the nature of the housefly through and through, because we cannot totally exhaust this mystery, in part because its origin is unavailable to us. Why did God make the housefly? What is its ultimate purpose? Okay, number 2. The ultimate basis of our freedom is the mystery of the human person as image of God. So something needs to be said about us human persons that is more than about the housefly. As the scriptures teach us, we're made in the divine image. So the mystery of ourselves is immeasurably deep and beyond that of all other creatures in our experience, and angels would be the only exception. Here is St. Thomas's opening statement that begins the moral part of his master work, the Summa. He begins with this teaching. The human person is made to God's image, and since this implies, as St. John Damascene tells us, that he is intelligent and free to judge and master of himself, 3 things. So then, now that we have agreed that God is the fashioning cause of all things, and that they issue from his power through his will, we go on to look at this image. That is to say, at the human being as the source of actions which are his own and fall under his responsibility and control. That's the prologue to a moral part of the Summa, which is roughly 70% of the work. It takes up a lot of books. Okay? And you can see that freedom is embodied in that opening statement. And there are three. We want to say now, next thing on our outline, 3 elements of interest are found in this statement. Number 1, St. Thomas begins moral theology by reminding us of the teaching on the image of God, which he developed a little earlier in the first part. Secondly, our image character is expressed through our intelligence and freedom, primarily. Not primarily in our body, but in our spirit. And 3, these powers, the 2 powers of our spirit or soul, the power to know, the power to love, or to will, same difference really, stand between our human nature and our free actions. So our nature comes first, then come these powers, and then come these actions. So our powers are effects, so to speak, of our nature, and they are causes of our actions. And that's why we have to look at them. In a word, because we are in the divine image, we necessarily imitate God's nature through our intellect and our will. And because we have these powers, we imitate God by exercising them and also partly refashioning ourselves through our actions and taking possession of ourselves through our moral life. So as images of God, we take, along with and subordinate to God, possession of ourselves through our actions. That is the moral life. And as the rest of his moral teaching will clarify in great detail, our actions will be good insofar as they appropriately act on the world in ways that advance the human person. And by world, I mean the physical world, other human beings, and also my own self, both personally, individually, and communally with others. But we must add the most essential element of our character's divine images. What is that? We are limited editions of the divine. What God has infinitely, which is unbounded spirit, or that's rather what he is, we have in limited fashion. We are finite creatures, but with an infinite capacity to know and to will and to love. And that will be the basis, ultimately, of human freedom. Next entry. Human freedom is a radical expansion of subhuman spontaneity. Let's stay with St. Thomas here, who speaks of freedom or liberty in terms of the voluntary, that's his word, in order to see how freedom is a radical expression of what animals experience in part. Thomas essentially begins with living beings, plants, animals, ourselves, who are distinguished from non-living beings by having their principle of movement from within. You have to push the rock, but you don't have to push a living thing. So the bunny moves through my garden without any strings from a puppeteer or without any sophisticated electronic guidance system from my hand. And because the bunny has a mobile body ready for quick movement, as well as a sophisticated set of perceptual powers, he is able to awaken his desires to really attractive goods, like the food in my garden. And so he participates in a rudimentary way in the voluntary, or freedom. What the rabbit lacks, however, is knowledge of the end. He doesn't know what he's doing. His so-called freedom is really limited by the demands of his nature, whether he's hungry or not, and also by the horizon of his perceptions. He can experience lettuce, but not God. Water, but not pursuit of the genuine good of others, including fellow bunnies, unless they're his offspring. In the words of Thomas, those things which have a knowledge of the end, ourselves and angels, are said to move themselves because there is in them a principle by which they not only act, but also act for an end. So, animals move, but they don't move themselves. We do. So freedom is found along this spectrum in an imperfect sense in animals, and it includes now in a special way human beings and angels, whose capacity to desire and to act is radically expanded by our intellect that has no bounds. Next point. Freedom requires attention to the human good for its legitimate exercise. Concretely then, how do we define human freedom, and how is it related to the human good? Because we are in part of the form of God, we have a divine form in limited edition, strictly speaking, we're gods and goddesses. Because we are imported a form of God or creaturely spirits, human persons have an unbounded capacity to know, and as a result, an unbounded capacity to desire and to will and to love. There's no end to it. And because we have powers that enable us to pursue what we desire, legs, muscles, memories, and so on, we are empowered. Freedom arises in the human image of God when our spiritual powers, intellect and will, are able through our complex nature, endowed with many powers, to seek after and attain the various goods of human life. Now the link between these two issues from the side of freedom is obvious, namely knowing and loving. When we begin even with this elementary sense of freedom, such as exemption from constraint or coercion, it's important to know whether freedom is good. Now we know out in the world that there are some who are fundamentally opposed to his practice. Visit North Korea. Every right-thinking person, on the other hand, is going to be opposed to certain exercise of freedoms, such as my freedom to harm you or kill you just for the fun of it. So right from the start then, human freedom cannot be thought of in isolation from the human good. A good that cannot be limited to one individual, since the exercise of one's freedom can be harmful to another human being. So human freedom right from the start must be both personal and communal. Nor can freedom be limited to all other human beings, since the larger context of the human race is the inhabited world, which he did not create. And we owe something to the Creator to treat his world with reverence. Strictly speaking, the world does not have rights, but God does. The relation of freedom to good, then, is the primary moral consideration, and it's tightly bound up with the relation of freedom in the individual to the good of the commonweal. We'll talk more about that later. Next point. Freedom, in the strict sense, is the joint achievement of will and intellect. Right now, let's abstract from empowerment. Freedom, in the strict sense, with respect to our spirit, is the joint achievement of will and intellect, which are two powers which respectively represent in me myself, what I want, what I need, what I desire, and reality, seeing things as they are, including the reality of myself. The way I'd like to look at it is that the intellect, in a way, is the guest house on the edge of the estate of the soul. And the various guests, which are the ideas, come to the guest house, and they belong to us, yet they don't. They have a freedom because, in a way, while they're in my understanding, I am bound by recognizing them and their rights, namely to be true as they are, whether I like it or not. So, if I have desire and power, but I do not have the capacity to know, I act blindly. If I can know all things but have no desire and or no capacity to possess what I seek, which is impossible, I'm paralyzed. I need first the desire to want the destination, which is the will. And then I need knowledge of the destination to know where I'm going. And then we have to talk later about the power to get from here to there, from desire to goal. More specifically, the will's contribution to freedom is enabling subjective ownership of my act as mine. The intellect's contribution to freedom is validating the genuine truth of the goods that I am seeking. That it is indeed true that these mushrooms are not poisonous that I am about to consume. That these goods are in the genuine interest of my nature, which I share with others. And the free exercise of powers in the service of our free choices, which often but not always involves the body, is then the third factor for consideration. Next point. Human freedom is restricted to consciousness. Now, when we speak just of the first two, our will and our intellect, we should not forget that these two powers belong to a unified person behind the various powers that he or she possesses. And that unity of person is something that's given to us. We didn't create it. It's part of the package. It's from God, from the perspective of faith, or from the perspective of reason, we say it's from nature. The unity of person is partly available to a conscious, well-functioning human being who has progressed at least to childhood. But it is also partly unavailable, which means that the unity of our person is not dependent on our consciousness, an important principle for the right to life. Rather, our consciousness is dependent on the unity of our person, which is larger than our consciousness. And since our consciousness is comprised of our actions of knowing and willing, and their sensitive counterparts, which are perceiving the sensible world and desiring it in many different ways, it follows that these actions are partly available to us and partly hidden from us. The part of our consciousness that is available to us is the background, the stage, as it were, for our free acts, which are joint actions of will. These free acts work on the self and the world that is open to us by the powers of our consciousness. The dimensions of ourselves that are beyond our knowledge and desire, for example, the unconscious, as it's sometimes called, these are obviously beyond the realm of human freedom. Next point. We're still following you, okay? Okay. Why we associate freedom with the will more than the intellect, which is a mistake of our present culture, with very terrible ramifications. You'll note that most people associate freedom with the will more than the intellect, if not exclusively. Why? The simple reason is that freedom seems to be said of the will even when the will is not acting in accordance with the genuine goods that a rightly functioning intellect presents to it. Enter evil. I choose something stupid or harmful. Not a good choice, you say, but Father Larry is free to do what he wants. Eventually what happens, since stupid and harmful choices are the hallmark of the human race, is that freedom ends up being said only of the will, and intellect is added only to distinguish good freedom from bad freedom. And to further support this association, freedom does not seem to be said of an intellect that is functioning without a will, that is unimpeded by coercion either from within or without. Take a sleepwalker who takes the reasonable path along the sidewalk in his sleep and avoids the swimming pool. He apparently has a sufficiently functioning intellect, but his conscious will is asleep. And so we don't have there, obviously, a moral act. And for this reason, we conclude that imperfect freedom, such as when I act stupidly or wickedly, is still freedom. But intelligent execution is not necessarily free, as in the case of sleepwalking. Thinking this way more often than not, since bad choices are constantly being made by everyone who seems to be free, we eventually lose a sense of the necessity of the intellect's contribution to the free act. Freedom becomes an attribute of the will, And we only add the intellect to distinguish between good freedom and bad freedom, good choices and bad choices. And so it becomes a truism that as long as someone is not coerced from without, that person is free, even if the goods chosen are inimical to his or her genuine good. And when we add the political doctrine of modernity on rights and apply it here so that every human being is autonomous, which means self-ruled, leave me alone, he or she is free to act well or poorly, productively or destructively, as long as no one else is harmed. Next point. Various kinds of coercion or constraint. External versus internal, which is always due to conscious decision. Now, an effective approach for dismantling this wrong conception, which I just laid out, is to undertake a brief analysis of coercion, a concept that slipped in the back door in our discussion here on freedom. And this is a good topic to consider, for if all three elements of knowing, willing, desiring, and empowering are required for freedom, then blockage in any area will result in diminished freedom or its loss, just as I will have a heart attack if any of the major arteries are fully blocked. So along with other moral theologians and philosophers, St. Thomas details these various obstacles, which we can briefly list as ignorance with respect to knowing, various psychological constraints with respect to desiring and willing, and the violence of coercion or constraint with respect to all our bodily powers. We can simplify this further by just naming two: external and internal coercion. Constraints imposed by oneself and constraints imposed outside of self by others or the world. External coercion out there arises either from the constraints that the world imposes, or more specifically from other human beings, who may coerce another either physically, I tie you up, or psychologically, I practice hypnosis or some type of psychological manipulation on you without your knowing it, or internal coercion. Now, to talk about internal coercion, this can only be psychological. For any physical coercion that one imposes upon oneself is always the result of a conscious decision, either from me or from another, like my evil psychiatrist, who's playing games with my head. Internal coercion that one imposes on oneself is due either to past free decisions of others that have helped rob me of my freedom, or due to my own past decisions that have the same result. In the second case, by original free acts with sufficient knowledge and freedom from coercion of whatever kind, I have chosen a partial good in place of a genuine good, and thereby I become a victim of my past abuse of freedom. Next point. Freedom as exemption from constraint or coercion. Example of the cello player. So in terms of this discussion, let us define freedom really simply now as exemption from constraint or coercion, whether internal or external. What do these constraints forbid or hinder? Well, if you think about it, pursuits, activities. Let's begin with the easier case of external constraints. I choose to pursue the goal of being a world-class cellist. But I live in the ghetto, and I have no means for purchasing a cello or hiring a cello teacher. The constraints are from without. But I win the lottery. I move out of the ghetto, buy a cello, and hire a first-class teacher. But then after years of practice, I must face the sad truth, what everyone has been trying to tell me, but I simply would not listen. Among my many gifts, outstanding cello playing is not to be included. My cello playing stinks. Next point. Freedom is won through sacrifice. So let's begin over again. with more modest ambitions. I simply wish to learn to play the cello in order to enjoy cello playing. I buy a modestly priced cello and I hire a music teacher who charges a modest fee for lessons. In order to have the future freedom of playing the cello, I must sacrifice current freedoms by practicing daily, forgoing more immediate pleasures and deferring other goals. So on a beautiful day like this, I practice instead of go swimming. I constrain myself now in order to be free tomorrow. Now here we must add something important. Freedom is relative to the degree that an activity is practiced well. Let's limit our focus here to the activity and not the agent. It's indisputable that to enjoy the cello requires that I play it, and to enjoy intensely the activity requires a higher degree of engagement in the activity. That is more practice and discipline. In general, we conclude that to the degree I constrain myself now, to that degree I become increasingly free later. And what is true of cello playing is also true of the life of virtue, one's relationship with God, one's capacity to be social, indeed, one's happiness. For happiness, if we accept Aristotle's definition of an activity, or rather activities of the soul in accordance with virtue, this happiness will be increased to the degree that I intensely engage in activities. And since these activities can only be mine if they arise from my free will, and can be only done well if I practice them, my happiness presupposes my freedom well executed. So my happiness can only be won through the proper exercise of activities that require patience, practice, discipline, and sacrifice. Which means that even on a personal level, the adage applies that freedom is not free. Next point. The alternative to sacrifice, the path of indulgence, leads to enslavement. Now, all of this seems like a lot of work. So the human temptation, encouraged by our fallen condition, is to take a shortcut. Instead of pursuing activities, why not instead pursue the life of pleasure? To be sure, pleasure is only attained through activities, but these are a lot easier, assuming certain factors exist, such as sufficient cash. These activities require little or no sacrifice. So let's consider the case of a playboy who pursues the life of eating, drinking, and fornication on southern beaches. Well supplied with cash from a rich pa, and pampered by a feckless ma, he lives the life of unshackled freedom on the beaches and in the bars and in the hotel rooms. But before long, he finds himself overweight, an alcoholic, and afflicted with sex addiction, incapable of any sustained activity, even those very activities that he indulged in, due to a thoroughgoing depression. Absolutely free to do whatever he chose, or so he thought, he now finds himself bound by passions insisting on their daily pound of pleasure from a nature that is now bent out of shape and increasingly losing the capacities to support this unnatural project. The end state here is either the reduction of self and freedom to a merciless urge that must be satisfied, we call those addictions, or paradoxically, the loss of the very desire that encouraged the dissolute pursuit of freedom in the first place. Without intending it, this individual never understood that his beginning point was not free, that he was simply responding at the very beginning in obedience to his demanding passions, and that in the end his freedom turned against his very nature and enslaved him. Concentrating the exercise of this so-called freedom on the most fundamental and bodily and accessible desires, he found that his human powers involved in these limited activities had become distended and engorged. Other parts of the soul shriveled up, and instead of a well-balanced individuals whose various powers expand and contract all day long insofar as they are called into appropriate service, He became a single-hearted pursuer of a finite good or a few goods that were unjustly and unrealistically required to be the bearer of infinite happiness. That's called idolatry. Next point. Provisional coercion led to genuine freedom. Dissolute freedom may lead to possibly permanent coercion. In the example above of the amateur cello player, provisional coercion led to genuine freedom. Here, with our fornicator and playboy, dissolute freedom could lead to possibly permanent coercion. What we learn from this last example is that freedom, when understood as the unhampered capacity to act according to our desires, which is the rough definition of our age, in fact, is rooted in a coercion that these overriding desires must be satisfied, which in turn leads to a total enslavement. False freedom, thus used by our nature in its present desire without regard to its genuine fulfillment in our nature, paradoxically results not only in the loss of freedom, but more tragically in the partial or complete destruction of the very human nature that human freedom depends on and is meant to serve. Next point. The vicious circle of not being able to choose goods due to a lack of freedom requiring them. The result is that the individual more or less loses the capacity for freedom in the strict sense. For now, the genuine good cannot be fully chosen. It becomes undesirable or partly desirable but unattainable by a weakened and damaged psyche, or completely desirable but unattainable since the individual's nature is no longer able to choose this good as genuine. In a word, by abusing my freedom, I enslave myself. To the degree that I am not free is the degree to which I have become a victim of my own sins and or those of others. I am like a person who has been tied up or who has tied myself up in chains, thrown away the key, and is out of earshot for help. Most likely, it's a joint project. We enter the game already damaged by wayward desires, mistaken principles, and original sin, which we still need to mention. And then we make our own the chains that others have prepared for us, and thereby continue the evil work they have begun. It's called enablement. The result is an apparently vicious circle. One is unable to choose genuine goods if the person is subject to outer or inner coercion. But on the other hand, he or she is not genuinely free if unable to choose these goods as genuinely fulfilling. Who can lead us out of this valley of death? Next point. St. Paul's analysis and solution. In a celebrated passage in his letter to the Romans, St. Paul describes this alienation from self that obtains between the past self and the present self, or the desiring self and the acting self. Quote, "For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law," for our purposes now, that is to say what my intellect presents to me, "I agree that the law is good, but in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me." Lost your freedom. "For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me." In a word, we have here an anthropological and moral mess. Such an individual that Paul is describing is clearly not free. But as Paul also argues, this is not a reason for pleading innocence. If I in part acquiesced in being tied up in chains and throwing the key away, I share in the blame. St. Paul's solution, which is the truly adequate one, is to hand one's enslaved condition to God through Christ, through initial grace of repentance, and then to be liberated by Christ's saving grace made available through the acceptance of faith and a life of faith that corresponds to that. Now, to speak just in natural terms, Plato and Aristotle recommend from the vantage point of good natural reflection a healthy environment, a good education, and a program of virtuous activity that trains us in securing the goods of life, which both presuppose and require human freedom. Next point. Our capacity for freedom is already compromised due to original sin and our ratifying it. As St. Paul makes clear, we do not approach human freedom from a neutral standpoint. From the gospel perspective, an important principle must then be stated. It is never the case that any human being afflicted with original sin is capable of a pure, original freedom that can be lost through one's harmful actions imposed on self. Let me put that in math terms. It is never the case that we are 100% responsible for our predicament, or, and I'm assuming here, conscious rational agents, that we are 100% blameless. We are already damaged, and for that reason, the attainment of genuine freedom is always ahead of us. Unfortunately, original sin has a tendency to a false freedom by encouraging us to make a path which is already difficult from the start, close to impossible as we continue through life. Witness our fornicating. Patterns of sinfulness develop through the practice of satisfying all those tempting urges, and these eventually rob me of freedom with respect to certain goods. And this enfeeblement then causes the collateral damage of intellectual blindness and volitional impairment in other spheres of human goods. And if I can no longer read the natural good, as Jesus says, when the eye can no longer see how dark the darkness will be. Look at our age. The person caught up, for example, in a bodily addiction is no longer free to be available to others and their needs, because the world is only seen so narrowly and wrong. Next point. Breaking the vicious circle of the inability to choose goods due to damaged will, which remains damaged without good choices. What's the way out? Let's speak naturally. For those who wish to speak just in terms of nature, as well as for those who incorporate the natural perspective within the gospel, what progress here can be made to be freed from this state of self-imposed slavery? A slavery described by the vicious circle of being unable to choose goods due to a damaged will, and being unable to heal this will without the capacity to choose the very goods that will heal it. The answer from human experience is theoretically unsatisfying, but it justifies itself in practice. I like to say the best way to overcome a vicious circle is just to jump in, roll up your sleeves, and get to work. By jumping right into the vicious circle and converting it into a virtuous one, and further by making the jump in both places at once. So, partly behaviorism and part right thinking. Attack the enemy everywhere. Now, the more satisfying answer, which undergirds human experience but is only available for believers, is that God's coming before, grace, is likely at work in every legitimate exercise of genuine human freedom. Those of you who have studied a little bit of the 12 steps, it's interesting, by the way, that the American Psychological Association has secularized even those. It's almost a perfect, I just noticed this the other day, an expression of the sacrament of reconciliation and the context of our faith in which confession is set. So the way that we get into conversion here ultimately depends at one point or another of God breaking in and doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And the 12 steps is basically religious because it requires that power to act. So, The more satisfying answer then is that God's grace is at work in every legitimate exercise of genuine human freedom. One may practice choosing genuine goods even though one's personal nature is repulsed by them, or at least finds them distasteful or boring, or chooses goods that are more attractive to the weak and damaged soul, but nonetheless are getting close, increasingly approximating the genuine good. A gradual approach. Even in a human sense, one proceeds here mostly on faith, at least in the sense of reasons only dimly perceived, as when I obey my counselor or my psychologist, even though it hurts like hell. With sheer volitional power, I go through the motions to the so-called good in the hope and hopeful expectation that eventually my nature will get on board, that the motions will eventually become mine, and that I will become free. For even on the way to the genuine goods which are consciously chosen, I already see, if imperfectly, that I am only free when I am choosing a genuine good, and only choosing the genuine good when I am free. Next point. Genuine freedom is always bounded by a nature and cannot be understood or experienced without pursuing genuine free goods. Genuine freedom understands that any creaturely freedom, whether that of an angel, human being, or in a limited sense an animal, is always bounded by the particular nature to which it belongs. Authentic freedom, for this reason, can neither be understood nor experienced apart from the complex set of human goods that constitute human happiness, and whose fundamental structure is based on our very nature, which we must simply accept as human creatures. These goods can be identified through an analysis of human nature, ends, desires, and activities, and is the work of moral theology and philosophy. Next point, freedom in light of the gospel. As both members of the church and citizens of the nation, our analysis must be attentive to the premises of both reason and revelation. Just now, we have simply presupposed our common human experience, but we can place this analysis in the higher light of revelation for a yet clearer understanding of the issues involved. As Cardinal Walter Casper has noted, God is absolute freedom. So as his images, we are, or rather should be, images of divine freedom, that is, sharers in God's freedom in a limited, creaturely way, in a human way. I say should be, rather than simply are, since freedom arises from our very nature. And our nature is a nature that must be developed, as the example of the cello player indicates. Our original freedom that precedes any exercise of freedom is simply the potential to exercise it. And our exercise requires sustained free acts that build on prior free acts. The particular way that we are to be free, then, is a human way, that is, according to our human nature that we share in common. A nature that, like any living nature, requires development in the environment of our world that includes the non-human world and other human beings. In the light of Revelation, we also see that it includes God, or rather that we are included in God's domain. Within that domain, as even now revealed to us in part, our freedom is reinterpreted in the light of grace. Our common fall from it, our reconstitution in it through the saving work of Christ, its ecclesial expressions in the church, and its indispensable role in leading us to our everlasting destiny. All of our rightly understood natural freedoms are not replaced, annulled, annihilated, or overshadowed by our grace-free condition, but are rather expanded, enhanced, developed, and perfected by our status as free sons and daughters of the Most High. In terms of this discussion, St. Paul, who was considered the apostle of grace, may also be called the apostle of freedom. For his entire grasp of salvation as won for us by Christ is basically an expansion of God's intention clearly articulated in the Benedictus hymn. He has come to his people and set them free. That is the gospel. In the early chapter of Romans, we saw how he lays out, or we didn't, but he does lay out an understanding of justification as God's free offer in Christ to liberate us from sin, both from within and without. Next point. Freedom within the larger context of the community and church presumes a just soul that is both other-serving and self-perfecting. This is basically another way of talking about the great commandment of love. God above all, neighbor as self. If grace builds on nature, graced freedom can only perfect the human freedom by cherishing it, building on it, and fostering it. In terms of the individual, freedom is enhanced by attention to the various goods of human life, which require a diversity of human activities that secures them in harmony and balance. The result, as Plato taught, is the well-constituted, balanced, or just soul. But perfecting myself simply personally would lead to an unjust outcome. So the balance here must be upset, or rather complemented, by a larger balance that places me in the service of my fellow human beings through the sacrifice of specialization. The truly just individual, then, is one who is partly specialized for the sake of others, so I become a shoemaker and you become a candlestick maker, and partly well-rounded. Each of us is responsible for perfecting our entire selves. So we both balance the requirements of justice in the soul and in the city, if I may speak, as Plato does. Freedom in the end, both before and after its inflection through grace, is found in the just individual who gives each of the essential powers of the soul its due to pursue their legitimate ends through appropriate activities. Said very simply, freedom is justice. Each of these relative freedoms then participates in the larger freedom of the whole person, that is the sum total of the various freedoms of the parts. Perfected individual freedom in turn contributes to, is inflected by, and sacrifices itself for the freedom of the community, just as the cello player sacrifices immediate satisfaction for long-term good. And the freedoms predicated of these larger wholes secure their ultimate destiny as participations in God as absolute freedom, who has placed himself freely in the service of making us free. This is freedom from the perspective of the individual and from God. Next point. There are two primary contents of freedom: choosing to share good and choosing an individual good. As we amble toward the religious and political context, let's make a few more helpful distinctions. There are two primary contents of freedom: choosing to share good and choosing an individual good. The first content, to share good, is choosing what I should do if I'm to be a good human being. I can choose against this, but to do so is wrong for me and for you. Example, choosing to harm another human being. Choosing to drive 100 miles an hour through Buckystown. Choosing to practice gluttony. Although Aristotle notes that what is fitting for Milo the wrestler is probably not fitting for me. I can't say, oh, I can eat as much as Milo. The second content, the individual good, is choosing a good that is appropriate for me and for me alone. To choose to play the piano instead of the violin, because of my fingers, because of my interests, my loves. Both activities are good, but I select out of the wide panorama of human possibilities these particular goods. I choose to befriend Tom and Dick, but not Harry, although Jerry calls Harry his best friend. Let's add here that in the end, only the individual can choose what is good for the individual, not the state, not somebody else, in order for it truly to be the good for this individual. A further helpful distinction, next point, and by the way, I'm just going to let you read, so we're going to just probably quit here, and let you kind of read the Catholic development of this doctrine. We'll quit here because we want to stay within the time limits. A further helpful distinction is that between freedom of choice as a good in itself and freedom of choice as the precondition for other goods. As a good in itself, freedom of choice is necessary for all human beings in order that they may make their own common goods and decide for themselves the individual goods that are appropriate. Footnote. This noble, beautiful, classical phrase has been hijacked by proponents killing unborn human beings. Horrible. At least by the time that you're an adult, you should decide which activities, interests, and desires you should pursue. It is also good that you exercise your God-given dignity as His image and have a wide field to pursue these activities. And as the precondition for goods, freedom of choice is necessary to secure many goods. For without choice, these goods simply cannot be acquired. For example, the good of receiving a reward for having chosen to do a task well. The good of scaling a mountain peak by having chosen to undertake the many laborious mini-acts that preceded it. And most importantly, the good of becoming a morally good human person that is only possible through freedom. Next point. Freedom of choice may be dangerous. Now here we have a potential conflict. As a good in itself, freedom of choice can sometimes choose in ways that destroys the possibility of choice as the precondition for other goods. And this happens when I tie myself up. This happens when the choice does harm to the chooser or to other choosers. In that case, freedom of choice may need to be limited in order that other fundamental goods be maintained. And sometimes these fundamental goods are so basic that future acts of freedom of choice depend on them. Example, a 2-year-old child chooses to run into the street before an approaching car. I make the quick determination that the child's freedom of choice, good as it is vastly subordinate to the good of preserving her life. And so I intervene so that she can live to choose another day. Another example. Life has become impossible for me, correcting too many exams and papers. So I perched myself on the bridge railing in order to jump into the raging river below. You make the obvious determination that once again my freedom of choice is subordinate to my right to life, and my duty to life, and your duty to interfere, your duty to save me. And so you pin me down against my will until the police arrive. You save me by constraining my freedom. Next point. Coercion or constraint can be an instrument in the service of freedom. In a word, coercion in the service of fundamental goods must sometimes interfere with freedom of choice in order to save or help the chooser. As in the familial realm, as when the father or mother stops the child from harming himself. As in the political realm, when a wise society stops the would-be substance abuser and the weak-willed person from destroying their lives through dangerous drugs or harmful pornography by instituting for them appropriate coercions. That is, laws, penalties, and sometimes enforced through rehabilitation. But note here that this coercion is in the service of human good. It must justify itself as a servant of freedom. The point here is to constrain another, just as the cello player constrains himself in order to arrive at a new or better state of freedom. Next point. Sometimes the good of freedom must take precedence. But sometimes the good of freedom of choice must take precedence over other goods, and for a number of reasons, even when bad choices are made. First, when the chooser needs to practice the exercise of this right of choice and develop himself or herself. And so the wise parent gives the child a space to make certain mistakes that will not do serious harm to the child. Second, when the good that is chosen against is of less value than the harm that is done by interfering with somebody's wrong choice. And here we can apply that good maxim. Error has no rights, but erring people do, beginning with the right to make some mistakes. Not all mistakes, but some. It is the mark of the wise society, the wise parent, the wise ruler, to know when to intervene and when not to, by keeping an eye at the same time on the common good and the personal good of freedom of choice on which the common good depends. And here it must be added is that a gray area exists among well-meaning citizens and even members of the church. Reasonable people may disagree about familial, societal, and political choices with respect to this question: when is the good so fundamental that coercion is justified to prevent the exercise of a destructive freedom of choice? Now, I'm going to let you read for yourselves at leisure the various points here. I just want to conclude with one or two points at the very end on second thought here. Also, the distinction between positive and negative threats I'm just not going to get to, because the spirit can receive only so much as the seat can endure, as they say. So let's just turn to the very end here, some final comments, if I could just do these last three quick points. I'm going to skip the first one. We need to be, let's just do the very last two. The relation between morality and our faith is complex. Again, this is a huge topic that cannot be adequately addressed here, like the ones I'm skipping over. But Catholic teaching has always recognized that the fundamental teachings of the moral law are inscribed on the human heart, available to well-functioning human reason, and recognized by the properly working human conscience. For example, you do not need to be a Christian or a believer to see that the destruction of unborn human life is morally wrong. Nevertheless, the gospel and Catholic teaching help us to secure, expound, and work out the details of what is called the natural law, the natural way to exercise our freedom correctly. And this belongs to a revelation which is prior to the revelation of Scripture and tradition. It's the revelation of creation, built into the very nature of our world. Final point. Religious freedom is both communal and personal. In light of the points made earlier about human and Christian freedom, and in light of the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, which you can review for yourself, and the relative independence of the moral law from the gospel, it is important to note that religious freedom is necessary to help to secure, clarify, and promote the moral law. And in light of these three elements of human freedom that Thomas identified for us, knowing, an unimpeded act of willing, and the actual power to execute, religious freedom requires as part of this very definition its active, public, and communal exercise. Always, of course, without infringing on the rights and good of others. Because the only way, as Jesus points out, that the gospel can be preached is to be preached to a free human being who can freely accept it and God's salvation. Thank you. So I guess I'm going to respond to any questions.
Yeah, if anybody has anything. Well, I have one in the absence of any others. You touched briefly on it and acknowledged that there was a gray area in the degree to which coercion or the stripping of freedom can be used to preserve greater freedoms. So something that we will deal with here in the county is when taxes are collected to be given to charitable organizations. Can you speak to what the morality of that, where morality exists in that transaction?
Can you expand on the issue a little bit more for me?
Well, I don't know how concrete we should get, but say taxes are collected. That's a state of coercion. But then those taxes are distributed to charitable organizations who will then do good with those funds. Can you talk about the morality in that transaction?
That's a huge topic that would be, somewhat of a gray area. I think from the point of view of Catholic teaching and Christian teaching, in terms of reading scriptures, there are certain elements that must be included. For example, people who are mentally retarded. We are required to care for them along the same argument that I'm required to run out and say that 2-year-old was running in front of a car. Okay? So, on the other hand, I remember when I was studying in Germany, back then in the FAT days, The state was paying for people to go to the spa, for health. Okay, now, clearly, that's something we probably want to talk about, right? And in the middle here, it would be this gray area. You also have a political question. Should we really be, taxing and then giving it to these private organizations? I mean, that's a complicated issue. Lots of these issues are very complex because, in a way, the church's position with respect to the modern world, it reminds me of how Socrates describes the case of the wise person who's down in the cave and is asked to play the game of figuring out what the figures on the wall that are manipulations of images that people are putting on there. In other words, you're like you're 3 or 4 places removed from real reality out in the world. And so here you are, you're sort of like those professors of mathematics and philosophy who were forced to sweep out cells in the Gulag archipelago. You know what I'm saying? So there are so many things wrong with so many things in our culture to begin with from a Christian perspective or a Catholic perspective. And then you're asked to come in and resolve this particular issue, and people think, oh, that's what the church, really believes. It's like, help, no, this is the best we can do under these circumstances. It's like going into a hospital, and people are dying left and right, and so, what do you do the best you can under the circumstances you have to deal with. So the church, unfortunately, is further hampered by the fact that I said this last year, and I'll say it again. I think we have a lot of work to do to develop a coherent political and social theology. And to some degree, Roman Catholicism needs to learn certain lessons from modernity in a good sense, and also from Protestantism with respect to human freedom, with respect to some of the principles that St. Thomas has articulated that have been lost. If I can put it this way, there's been an unhealthy trend in Roman Catholicism, which the Second Vatican Council helped to, fortunately, unravel. But it lasted really from the close of the Middle Ages until about 1965 towards centralization and toward too much of a common good approach, which overused coercion, both in terms of people's individual moral lives and also in terms of freedoms for proper choice, both in the church, in religious life, and in the secular sphere, okay? So, now if you read through the Vatican document, I think you can see the church, to be honest, has come a long way, okay? Because she's had to learn many of these lessons. If Thomas Aquinas would just have been Pope on these issues for about 400 years, he would have been in much better shape, because he was very much steeped in St. Paul, and he was an apostle in a sense of freedom as well. And deep down there's been this distrust. If I can make the further point too, is that people with power, have a vested interest in limiting freedom for their own agenda. Okay? Power corrupts absolute, power corrupts absolutely. This is one expression of it. And this is, we still have to go back and relearn Jesus' fundamental teaching that power is to be placed in terms of service. Okay? And Patton's principle is good here too, General Patton. Never command where you first yourself have not gone, which is why Jesus went to Calvary. Been there, done that. Did I answer the question by evading it successfully?
There's a lot of content in there at least.
If I'm understanding you right, then decentralization is the way the church is going in accordance with Vatican II, whereas there'd be less pull from the top.
Yeah, if I can say in Thomistic terms, the principle that we need here, which is ultimately based on the Trinity, is the principle that's sometimes called subsidiarity in the political realm. It's what I call shared causality. It's just the way you're built. God has given you a share in his own freedom. He could have made robots, and he did. They're called plants. Okay? The plants are basically robots. They do exactly what they're told to do by God. Animals, have a little bit of spontaneity. But you're closer to God than you are to animals and plants at this very important point. So God shares with you this domain of freedom. And in a way, you could almost say from a human point of view, he limits himself. Okay, so it's part of the divine will that I, like a child growing up and making mistakes, is part of the divine will that God lets me make mistakes, called sin. Okay, so the principle of shared causality is a gift from God by which creation, the created world, can in fact develop and more closely imitate precisely through freedom. Now, when we bring that into the political sphere, the same thing is going to be true, and as the church is correctly taught, the principle here is that always allow on the local level, to say it politically, as much power and freedom as possible. And so it's not favoring decentralization or sin, it's both. Because a properly constituted soul, city, or commonwealth is to have the right balance between centralization and decentralization. And so the common only does what the common should do. And then what the common above, the first charge of centralized authority is to institute freedom
So
on
then
the local level as much as
the
possible.
commonality is going to disperse.
Pardon me?
You're going to lose that commonality, and therefore, when you're saying that the Catholics have to develop a political morality, if you're going to encourage this decentralization of conscience on the very lowest of levels, how are they ever going to have a commonality to say this is our Catholic conscience?
Through the alternative to coercion. It's called persuasion. When John and James, they want to rain down fire on heaven in this town in Samaria because they're not listening to Jesus and the apostles. And Jesus only turns to rebuke them. The only way you're going to bring those citizens of Samaria under the gospel is to freely proclaim the gospel and to persuade and to take the chance of being rejected, which is what happens. I mean, now, there's also to a degree in which the state can coerce commonality, okay, with respect to the collection of taxes, with respect maybe to making decisions about eminent domain, with respect to where the road is going to go. So we don't want to overstate this case. And I laid out the various principles here by which the principle of shared causality or subsidiarity can be applied in a way that's wise and just, but again, a balance between the common good and the individual good. And the paradox, if you go too far in either direction, you end up destroying the very ground on which you stand. If I'm so interested in the common good that I suppress individual freedoms, then I have North Korea. What common good do you have there? You have a bunch of corrupt, immoral, murderous thugs at the top, and everybody else pretty much is suffering. Okay? On the other hand, if you have wild, dissolute freedom in this negative sense that I was criticizing, where anybody can do anything and destroy themselves and other people, then you don't have you end up losing the very personal freedom that you so value. So they need each other. And when you practice the principle of shared causality correctly, then you end up, each supports the other. They're not in tension with each other any more than the three persons of the Trinity are in tension with the one God. You've got both there, and you keep the two together. Working out the details is something that we do both communally and personally. In your own life, you do it personally. Communally, we do it together. That's why political discourse is complicated and complex and is a mix of coercion and persuasion. But the default mode is freedom. That's the point I'm trying to make. I hope that kind of balances it out a little bit more. Does that sound right?
Okay. I'm confused on how we as Catholics are going to come up with this communal concept, whether it be moral or political.
Well, if we have to a degree, I just think a lot more work needs to be done. I think too much of Catholic political and social thought is very time-bound, and also even certain teachings in the Vatican, Second Vatican Council, especially Gaudium and Spes, need to be revisited. Some people have pointed out, for example, that their view of the world is is irresponsibly optimistic, and I kind of tend to agree. You know, that was 1965, and the world, you know, looks very different right now. So, yeah, if I had another life, I would like to just work on this problem, but it's huge. It really is. And in part, it's the problem what I began by saying, namely that the church is asked to make decisions and to offer teachings on today a secular society that has so many fundamental problems wrong with it, that simply telling them what's fundamentally wrong with you is not going to help anybody. You know what I mean? It's like a person who's afflicted with 55 diseases, and the doctor just says, well, I'm not even going to how can I even get started here? I mean, because it's just so, you know, basically wrong. You have to just work on what's here right now, do the best you can, sometimes in an ad hoc sort of way. But we do need too many Catholic thinkers at so-called Catholic universities are too much influenced by secularism. And so their approach to many of these issues, I think, tends to be very much imbued with the spirit of modernity and is actually hostile to Catholic Christian principles. That's my view of the matter, but that's another lecture, so I really can't get into that.
We could probably take maybe one more question.
Sure.
It was brought to the point that giving taxes to the government and then the government gets charity. Shouldn't charities solely be privatized? Because let's say you give your taxes to the government and they give it to a charity that you don't agree with, i.e. Planned Parenthood. That's, unproductive.
Yeah, I mean, right there are so many problems with that. First of all, why would you call Planned Parenthood a charity? Secondly, you have to unpack the notion of charity, because some issues... Pardon? Pardon? Right, but I mean, you know, as Confucius says, all problems begin by not assigning the proper names to things. Okay, so call things what they are. And but the point I would make here is that is that even the word charity here needs to be looked at, because the first principle of charity really is justice.
Well,
Justice.
the fact of the matter is that the government's taking money from us.
That's. I mean, what's wrong with that is precisely the agenda of Planned Parenthood, which should be illegal to begin with, at least in part. Okay. So again, that's an excellent example of what I'm talking about. This house is so sick that I don't know where to begin with to dispense my antibiotics and my surgical instruments. But the way to begin there is to stop funding, because it's not a charity, and the state has already made a fundamental. Today I was just doing some research, and I found that there's a commemorative stamp for Harvey Milk, who was the first openly homosexual politician in America back in 1970. So right there, just looking at it now from a fair point of view, I'm not a Christian, just from a fair point of view, roughly, you know, the nation is divided right down the middle on this issue. But the federal government is playing big nanny and saying, you 50% over here who are pro-gay are morally correct, and you 50% over here are morally wrong. You see first of all, they have no concept of the natural good or natural right, natural law. And secondly, who are they to determine this question for the entire society? You know, this whole bureaucratic nanny approach to morality that uses coercion and involves all sorts of injustices is clearly wrong. Now, you can imagine another administration comes in and reverses that, which just shows the whole, which would be in a way good, but in a way it is exacerbating the problem. And the problem is we've lost our moorings with respect to what the natural good is, both communally and personally. We've lost the hold of natural law. And unfortunately, the debate out there wants to associate natural law exclusively with Christianity, and especially Roman Catholicism. We cannot fall into that trap. These issues that we're, for the most part, fighting are not Christian issues. We're defending Jews and Muslims, and even to a degree atheists, by defending religious liberty. Because the same principles can be turned against us. You know what I mean? Where you say, oh, we're going to impose Christianity on everybody. John and James, you're right. Okay, we're going to call in the weapons and take this city out if they don't answer to Christian principles. No, because when you do that, then you end up once again violating the fundamental principles of religious liberty, and therefore the very gospel that you're intending to promote. And so you end up destroying the very ground and cut off the very branch that you were swinging on. I hope I answered that question. So, good. But I see from your questions that a lot of you, were interested more in the political issues. But you'll get the chance on Wednesday, and I think Ben will remind you of that. When those issues will be more explicitly dealt with. But I hope that this was helpful for giving you the kind of the philosophical and theological background for freedom. And now this is like chapter 1. Now, hopefully you have some tools, some distinctions that you're ready now to begin to tackle some of these issues and applications. Thank you.
Yes, and that was certainly our intent, to try and lay out some of the underpinnings, some of the very foundation of what allows us as Catholics or as Christians or as people of faith generally to help us know what is good and what is worth pursuing. And in many ways in our lives, inseparably that will spill over into politics. But to first understand those structural definitions of what we find good and pursuing and why. Once we know that, then we can answer all these other more complex questions, or try to. Thank you again, Father, for covering so much ground and such critical ground. We sincerely appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight, and based on some of the questions we had, maybe we'll drag you back out here. Get into some more specifics. Our next Fortnight for Freedom event is this Wednesday, the 25th, where, as Father Donohoo said, Joshua Lyons is going to come out and talk about the myth of separation of church and state. I hope you'll join us again at 7 p.m. for that. That's all we have tonight, so thank you for joining us, and God bless you.
Very good. You forgot to mention our cookies. It ain't over till the cookies are in.
Box them up and take them to the next.